the American Civil War, a conflict so monumental it left an indelible mark on the course of American history. Hey there, welcome to my channel. It's me, and this is Crash Course U.S. History. And today, we're going to look at the causes and consequences of the Civil War, starting with how it began. Now, before we dive in, if you want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can join our community on a crowdfunding platform. By 1860, slavery was still legal in 11 states, all of them south of the Mason-Dixon line, which was the boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania. However, it was becoming more and more clear that the South's desire to maintain slavery was in direct conflict with the anti-slavery beliefs of many in the North. The first shots were fired in April 1861 at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The fort was being occupied by Union troops and was surrounded by Confederate forces. When the Confederates demanded that the Union surrender the fort, the Union refused. So the Confederates opened fire. However, the South had better military leaders, especially early in the war. For the Confederacy, General Robert E. Lee is considered the greatest general in American history. The Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863 is considered the turning point of the war. In January 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. This changed the nature of the war from one to preserve the Union to one to abolish slavery as well. It was here that Lee's army advanced into the North was decisively defeated by General George Meade. They fought in all areas of the military, and some units distinguished themselves for their bravery and sacrifice. Lincoln's death came as a shock to the nation and threw the country into mourning. Civilians on both sides endured immense hardship, especially those in the South. The war ended slavery in the United States and reaffirmed the supremacy of the federal government over the states. In the years following the Civil War, the nation entered into the painful and complicated period known as Reconstruction. As the war dragged on, the conflict became more total, meaning soldiers and civilians alike were targeted. Homes were destroyed, crops were burned, and entire communities were decimated. One of the most well-known examples of total war during the Civil War was Sherman's march to the sea in 1864. General William T. Sherman led his troops on a 68-mile march through Georgia. His army destroyed railroads, factories, and plantations in order to break the South's will to fight. One of the most famous black regiments was the 54th Massachusetts, which became famous after its heroic assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. This battle resulted in an estimated 51,000 casualties, making it the single bloodiest day in American history. His strategic brilliance and tactical genius led the Confederate Army to victory in many important battles, most of which took place in his home state of Virginia. He was fiercely loyal to his state and willing to sacrifice everything to ensure its freedom. After 34 hours of bombardment, the fort fell and the Union garrison surrendered. And just like that, the Civil War had begun. Tensions were high, and the two sides were growing further and further apart. By early 1865, the Confederacy was out of resources and hope. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. With the surrender of Lee's army, the war was effectively over, though it wasn't always acknowledged as such, especially in the early years of the war, when it came to winning the support of European powers who had abolished slavery. Many families had members on both sides of the conflict, because state lines were often the dividing point between family loyalties. And while the war would eventually come to be known as a war about slavery, at the start, only about 1 in 5 Southerners were enslaved. Most white Southerners believed they were fighting to protect their way of life, including their economic system, which relied heavily on enslaved labor, because it was clear that the central cause of the war was slavery. So let's talk about how the Civil War started. And just like that, 7 states seceded from the Union. South Carolina was the first to leave in December 1860. They were followed by Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, and Georgia. General Ulysses S. Grant led the Union Army to victory. He was known for his relentless tactics and willingness to take heavy losses to achieve his objectives. Together, these 7 states formed the Confederate States of America with President Jefferson Davis, formerly a senator from Mississippi. Well, technically, the Civil War began in 1861, after decades of mounting tension over slavery, states' rights, and political power. But what really kicked it off was Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. You see, for several decades prior to the Civil War, the question of slavery in new territories had created an increasing divide between the northern and southern states. As the U.S. expanded westward, the debate over whether or not to allow slavery in these new lands grew more and more contentious. Now, the original 13 colonies had all been slave societies, but the northern states had begun to move away from slavery earlier on. When Abraham Lincoln, who ran on an anti-slavery platform, was elected president in 1860, the 7 states of the Deep South, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Virginia, felt that their way of life was under threat. Once the Confederacy was formed, the 2 sides began preparing for war. From that point on, the goal of the Union was to preserve the nation, and the Confederacy was formed to protect their way of life, which of course included slavery. As the war began, brother really did fight against brother. The North had a big advantage in that it had more factories, more population, and better infrastructure. However, ultimately, the North's superior resources and manpower prevailed. There were many major battles during the Civil War, including Bull Run, or First Manassas, Shiloh, Chickamauga, Antietam, or Sharpsburg, and Gettysburg. By this time, the war had taken a decisive turn. More than 180,000 Black Americans served in the Union Army during the Civil War. It wasn't just soldiers who suffered during the Civil War. In 1864, Lincoln was re-elected, which showed the North's resolve to finish the job. Just days later, on April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. The Civil War was a watershed moment in American history. It resulted in the deaths of over 620,000 Americans, making it the deadliest conflict in American history. And that brings us to the end of Part 1 of Crash Course U.S. History. I'll see you next time.